Okay, here is someone who says, "Good morning, Dennis. Happy to see Benedicta in another video. I tried to explain this," I assume he means this concept of eating low carb, "to my parents. They just can't comprehend the idea of fiber." I'm not quite sure I know what he means by that. Can't comprehend the fiber part. The main thing to comprehend is you've got to cut your carbs, fiber or no fiber, but fiber can help. If you eat foods that are high fiber, but they don't have many carbs otherwise, like chia seeds, then it shouldn't raise your blood sugar. But he says, "I tried to tell this to my parents. I told them just eat fiber with their regular meals because they won't listen. And they said," their response to his pleading to try to eat better and healthier and lower carb, their response was, "I lived this long and I'm going to eat this way till God takes me." He says, "I love them, but I stopped trying. They are 79 and 76 years of age, both severely overweight and pre-diabetic. So I've tried, they don't listen." And the response is, "Well, I've gone this far, and I'm just going to keep on until God takes me." Well, if they've made it that far and they're not diabetic and they're still walking around, they don't have neuropathy and they're feeling pretty healthy, well, they've done pretty well. And some people can. It was interesting what one person wrote underneath this person's comment. Somebody else wrote this: "I'm 73 and I changed." What beautiful words. I'm 73. Can't teach an old dog new tricks, but in this case, they did learn something. I'm 73. I changed. What you have to accept is that one has the ability to change. Yeah, absolutely. We can change. And he says, or she, I'm not sure if this was a man or a woman, "I also don't want to be a burden on people. I exercise, eat low carb, high fat, and keep my body busy. I reversed 20 plus years of type 2 because I changed." Wow, isn't that awesome? 20 years plus of type 2 diabetes, I changed, my numbers changed, and if I'm reading this right, they're no longer diabetic according to the numbers. One of the beautiful things about people with type 2 diabetes is that they can often see a reversal of their numbers and sometimes of their neuropathy and other issues they have in a relatively short time. You know, if I were to walk from where I live in Texas up to Canada, I don't know how long that would take me, several months, I'm sure, if I kept up a good pace. But let's say I walked up to Canada to visit my brother in Toronto. Can't think of his name right now, but he has a diabetes channel as well. He brags about his pink chaffle. We kid each other about that. Anyway, say I walked up to visit my brother in Toronto, and let's say it took me 6 months to do it. Had to stop along the way and camp out and so forth. Now, if I get up to Toronto and say, well, it's time to walk back, got to go back home, and it took me 6 months to get up to Toronto from Dallas area, one would assume it's going to take me 6 months to get back home, because chances are it's going to take just as long going back as it did going there. And many of you listening to me, you've been on the journey toward diabetes, not for the last year or two. It may be just the last year or two that you became officially diabetic and you got diagnosed as diabetic. You've actually been making the journey and walking toward diabetes for the last 30 years in many cases, 20, 30, even 40 years. It just takes a while to get there. So we would assume, okay, if I've been working on my diabetes for 30 years and I finally arrived, we would assume it's going to take 30 more years to get back to where I was. And that's bad news, because if you're 60 now, you probably don't have 30 years to try to get back. And even if you do, that's a long time to wait to get back. The good news is it may take you 30 years to become diabetic, but you can become non-diabetic often in as little as 4 months or 6 months or 1 year by making a severe dietary change and giving up the sugar and most of the carbs, not necessarily all, but most of the carbs. No more breakfast cereal, no more baked potatoes, No more starchy foods, no more sugary foods, no more Cokes, no more fruit juices that are loaded with natural sugar. No more fruit. I'm going to eat mostly meat and low-carb vegetables, maybe some dairy products such as heavy cream and cheese. Often you can get back what took you 30 years to get there will take you 6 months to get back under the numbers. Now, I know people will argue all day long that, well, you didn't really beat diabetes, you're just avoiding it, and they'll make all these arguments. I'm not going to argue about that, but according to the numbers, oftentimes, no guarantee, but oftentimes in 6 months, give yourself 6 months, make a dietary change and see how good you'll feel, how better your numbers are, how your A1C will go from a 12 or a 10 down to a 5.8 or a 5.5 or a 6.2, under that 6.5 diabetic level, according to U.S. standards. You'll be amazed. Now, even if it takes you a year, that's still a lot better than the 30 years it took you to get there. Because for the last 30 years, in many of your cases, probably most, every high-carb meal, every piece of pie, every piece of cake, every white bread roll, every cinnamon roll, every donut, that's all part of the journey to get you to the land of diabetes, diabetes nation. Reason would say, all right, it took me 30 years to get here. It'll take me 30 years to get back. Nope, it won't. You can get back in 6 months oftentimes. The first step to getting back out of the nation of diabetes, guess what? Turn around. Turn around. Change your way. And you'll be amazed how much better you will feel. I was looking at how long it took certain books to be written. And Gone with the Wind took 10 years for Margaret Mitchell to write that book. Les Miserables, 12 years. Lord of the Rings, 17 years in the writing. Wow. But diabetes can often take longer than that. You are usually starting in your 20s with a junk diet and not at all concerned about where you'll be when you turn 55 or 60. So you start in your 20s, you work your way through your 30s. The doctor says, no, you're not diabetic. You work your way through your 40s. Often you get through your 40s, you're not diabetic, but maybe some symptoms are starting to pop out. But eventually you get there and the doctor comes back after he's tested you and says, well, I've got some bad news. You're type 2 diabetic. Your A1C is 9, 10, 12, 14. It's not like you suddenly turned. It's not like you weren't diabetic. You weren't even close to diabetic. There was no problem in your 20s, 30s, 40s. But according to really metabolic truth and understanding the metabolic issues, you've been working on that for a long time. You've been writing that book for 30 years. It's time to turn around and go back the other direction. Most Americans cannot even imagine the terrible poverty that pervades much of Africa. Many Africans eat meat 2 or 3 times per year, not because they're vegans, but because they cannot afford chicken, beef, or even fish. Many African children never receive a toy as a gift, not for their birthday, not for Christmas, not ever. It's all parents can do to feed their families, and toys for children are considered a waste of money. Many African widows are forgotten, neglected, and live out their remaining years in terrible poverty, often in a constant state of near starvation. We cannot feed all of Africa by any means, but we can at least do something for some of them. We arranged a sumptuous early Christmas dinner this month in 2 communities, one in Nigeria and one in Kenya. And we made sure they had plenty of chicken, along with vegetables, ugali or fufu, and other delicious foods. But there was more than just a nice meal. We set up a special Christmas service for pastors and their wives and the local widows that would last throughout the afternoon. There was praise and worship. We had the building decorated with ribbons to give the event a special Christmas flavor. We had a local pastor preach a Christmas sermon, and then there was more praise and worship. And then we arranged a large-screen TV showing of a Birth of Jesus Bible study that Benedict and I did recently. We provided food for the local widows and toys and school supplies for the local orphans. Some of the widows were so moved by being remembered that they had tears in their eyes. For many of these orphans, receiving a toy was the first time in their entire lives that they had ever received a toy for Christmas. And everyone so appreciated the dinner. They just loved that chicken and the vegetables and the ugali or fufu. John the Baptist said this, "Let him who has 2 tunics share with him who has none." We Americans, well, we're the ones with the 2 tunics, or maybe 5 or 10 or 100. And it's only right that we should share with our struggling African brothers and sisters and make their lives a little bit easier and happier when we can. We do this because of the love of Jesus, and we do it in His name. Please pray about making a generous donation in support of these outreaches and the teaching of God's Word to the nations.
Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas!